The Atlantic Monarch was meant to be a dream vacation, a 5-day cruise through the Caribbean with my girlfriend Sophie. She'd always wanted to go on a cruise, and after months of her subtly hinting, I finally caved and booked the trip. Neither of us had ever been on a cruise before, so we were both excited for a week of sun, relaxation, and endless food. The first 2 days were exactly what we'd hoped for: blue skies, calm seas, and plenty of activities to keep us entertained. We spent our days lounging by the pool, drinking fruity cocktails, and enjoying the shows and entertainment the ship had to offer. It felt like we were living in a floating paradise. Then, on the third night, things started to get weird. Sophie had fallen asleep early after a long day in the sun, but I was still wide awake, lying in bed with the balcony door open, letting the cool ocean breeze filter into the room. I was just about to turn off the TV when I heard something strange. It was faint at first, barely audible over the sound of the ship cutting through the water, but as I listened closer, I realized it was music. Soft, ethereal singing coming from somewhere outside. I figured it was just one of the ship's late-night performances carrying through the open air. But something about it didn't feel right. The singing didn't sound like the usual pop songs or covers we'd heard on the ship. It was more haunting, like a distant mournful choir, echoing through the night. I stepped out onto the balcony, hoping to catch a glimpse of where the sound was coming from. The night was still, the ocean a vast black expanse stretching endlessly in all directions. The only light came from the distant stars and the soft glow of the ship's deck below. But there was no sign of anyone performing, no crowd, no music equipment, just the eerie, ghostly singing drifting on the wind. I leaned over the railing, trying to locate the source. It seemed to be coming from below, somewhere near the lower decks. I listened for a few more moments, my curiosity growing, before deciding to investigate. I grabbed a jacket, quietly left the room so as not to wake Sophie, and made my way down the ship's labyrinth of corridors. The deeper into the ship I went, the more unsettling the atmosphere became. The bustling energy of the upper decks was gone, replaced by an eerie silence, punctuated only by the occasional creak of the ship and the soft hum of the engines. I followed the sound of the singing, which grew clearer the farther I went, until I found myself near the bowels of the ship, far below where passengers were usually allowed to go. I stopped at a door marked, "Crew Access Only." The singing was loudest here, almost as if it was coming from just beyond the door. I hesitated for a moment before pushing it open. Inside was a narrow, dimly lit corridor that seemed to stretch on forever. The air was damp and heavy with the smell of salt and something else, something metallic, like old rusting machinery. I walked down the corridor, the singing growing louder with each step. It wasn't just one voice now, but many, an entire chorus of voices, harmonizing in a language I couldn't understand. The sound was both beautiful and terrifying, like a funeral dirge from some forgotten time. At the end of the hallway, I found another door, this one slightly ajar. A soft, flickering light spilled out from the cracks. I pushed it open, my heart pounding in my chest. What I saw inside stopped me cold. The room was small, like an old storage area that hadn't been used in years. The walls were lined with rusting metal shelves, and the floor was covered in a thin layer of water, as if it had recently flooded. But the most disturbing thing was the figures standing in the center of the room. There were about 10 of them, all standing in a circle, facing inward. They were passengers. I could tell by their clothes, but something was wrong. Their skin was pale, almost translucent, and their eyes were closed. They stood motionless as if in a trance, their lips moving in perfect unison as they sang that eerie, haunting melody. My heart raced as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. Were they sleepwalking? Some kind of group hypnosis? But the longer I watched, the more unnatural it seemed. Their movements were too synchronized, too deliberate, like they were being controlled by something unseen. Suddenly, one of them, a man in his 40s, opened his eyes. His gaze locked onto mine, and I froze. His eyes were wide, empty, like he wasn't seeing me, but something beyond. His mouth continued to move, singing that same haunting tune, but his body began to shift, turning slowly toward me. One by one, the others did the same, their dead, glassy eyes opening, their heads snapping in my direction. I backed out of the room, my heart hammering in my chest. The singing grew louder, more frantic, as if they were beckoning me, calling me to join them. I turned and ran, not caring about the noise I made, not caring about anything except putting as much distance between myself and whatever that was. I didn't stop until I was back in the cabin, slamming the door behind me and locking it. Sophie stirred in her sleep, mumbling something, but didn't wake up. I stood there panting, drenched in sweat, trying to make sense of what I'd just witnessed. For the rest of the night I lay in bed, wide awake, my ears straining to hear any hint of that awful singing. But the ship was silent, nothing but the sound of the waves against the hull. The next morning I tried to shake off the fear. Maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe it had just been some kind of weird late-night performance or crew ritual. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. There was something wrong with that ship. Later that day, I noticed something strange. A few of the passengers I'd seen in that room, the ones who had been singing, were walking around the ship as if nothing had happened. They looked normal, laughing, eating, enjoying themselves. But there was something off about them. Their smiles seemed forced, their movements too stiff, too rehearsed. And now and then, I'd catch one of them staring at me, just for a moment, before turning away. I tried to tell Sophie about it, but she didn't believe me. "You were probably just dreaming," she said, brushing it off. "You've been stressed lately. Let's just enjoy the rest of the trip, okay?" I wanted to believe her. I wanted to forget about that night and pretend everything was fine. But as the days went on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, that those passengers weren't just normal people. There was something wrong with them, something I couldn't explain. On the last night of the cruise, I woke up to the sound of singing again. It was louder this time, and closer. I bolted upright in bed, my heart pounding, and listened. The voices were coming from the hallway outside our cabin. I got up, moving as quietly as I could, and opened the door just a crack. The hallway was filled with passengers, all standing in perfect rows, their eyes closed, their mouths moving in unison as they sang that same haunting melody. They were everywhere, filling the corridor from one end to the other, their voices blending in a chilling harmony. And then, just as I was about to shut the door, one of them opened their eyes and looked directly at me. I slammed the door and locked it, backing away until I was pressed against the far wall, my chest heaving with fear. The singing continued, louder and louder, until it felt like the walls were vibrating with the sound. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence that followed was even more terrifying. I never opened the door again that night. When we docked the next morning, I didn't say a word to anyone. Sophie was cheerful, talking about what a great time we'd had, but I couldn't shake the images from my mind. The singing, the blank stares, the way they had all moved in perfect sync. I haven't told anyone about what I saw that night, and I haven't been on a cruise since. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear that singing, faint, distant, like it's coming from somewhere deep beneath the waves. Cruises are supposed to be an escape, a place where the stresses of the real world melt away, and all you're left with are endless buffets, sunny days, and beautiful ocean views. That's what I thought when my buddies and I booked a week-long cruise to celebrate our college graduation. It was supposed to be a trip we'd never forget, but not for the reasons I thought. It was me, Jake, Ryan, and Lucas. 4 guys ready to cut loose before diving headfirst into the grind of the real world. We boarded the Ocean Sapphire with high spirits, already planning which bars we'd hit first, which shows we'd catch, and how much sun we could soak in. The first couple of days were exactly what you'd expect: drinks, partying, and the kind of chaos that only young guys on vacation can get into. But then things started to feel off. It was subtle at first, like a background noise you can't quite pinpoint. I began noticing small things, the way the ship seemed colder than it should have been, even in the middle of the day. The crew members seemed tense, more focused on keeping us all entertained than actually enjoying their work. It was like there was a secret they were trying to keep from us. The ship was massive, and on the third night, after a day of drinking and lying on the deck, I wanted to explore the parts of the ship we hadn't seen yet. While the others were hitting up the casino, I told them I was going for a walk. They didn't question it. They were too focused on making back the money they'd lost at blackjack. I started my journey through the more remote parts of the ship. At first it was just curiosity, wandering past the pools, lounges and dining areas, hoping to find something interesting. But as I ventured further down the winding corridors, the atmosphere changed. The bright lights and polished chrome of the upper decks gave way to darker, narrower hallways that felt neglected, like no one had walked them in a long time. There was this smell. It wasn't overpowering, but it was there, faint, like stale water and something metallic. I figured it was just the smell of the ship's machinery, but the deeper I went, the worse it got. Eventually I found myself near a stairwell that led down to the lower decks, where the crew stayed. There was a sign that said "Crew Access Only," but I wasn't planning on turning back just yet. I was too curious. I mean, what's the harm in exploring, right? It's not like I was going to get into trouble for checking out the ship. The moment I stepped onto the first landing, the air seemed to change. It was colder down here, the lights dimmer, flickering occasionally, as if the electricity wasn't quite reliable this deep in the ship. I moved forward cautiously, my footsteps echoing against the steel walls, creating a rhythm that made the silence feel heavier. The further I went, the more disoriented I felt. The layout of the ship down here didn't make sense. The hallways twisted in ways that seemed illogical, like some kind of maze designed to confuse anyone who wandered too far. I passed doors with no markings, some slightly ajar, others locked tight. I half expected to run into a crew member who would tell me to turn around, but there was no one. I came across a door at the end of one hallway that was slightly cracked open, with a dim yellow light spilling out. I don't know what possessed me to push it open, but I did, and I immediately regretted it. The room was small, and filled with old rusted equipment. Pipes ran along the ceiling and walls, and the floor was slick with water. But it wasn't the room that terrified me, it was what was in the center of it. There was a figure, hunched over, facing away from me. It was wearing a soaked, grimy uniform, like one of the crews. The air was thick with the stench of rot, and I could hear the sound of water dripping from the ceiling, echoing off the metal walls. I stood frozen, my breath caught in my throat. The figure didn't move. I whispered, "Hey, are you all right?" Nothing. I was about to turn and leave when the figure began to shift. Slowly, unnaturally, it turned toward me, its movements jerky, like it was being pulled by invisible strings. When it finally faced me, I almost screamed. His face was wrong. His skin was pale and bloated, like he'd been submerged in water for days. His eyes were wide open but lifeless, staring right through me. His lips were split, and his mouth hung open slightly, as if trying to form words that wouldn't come. I backed out of the room as quietly as I could, my heart pounding in my chest. I turned and bolted down the hallway, not caring about being quiet anymore. I just needed to get out of there. My mind was racing. Was that a real person? A body? Had I just seen a corpse? As I ran, the hallways felt even more twisted than before, like the ship was deliberately trying to trap me. I reached a stairwell and practically flew up the steps, desperate to put as much distance between myself and whatever was down there. When I finally reached the upper decks, everything seemed normal again. The lights were bright, and I could hear the hum of passengers enjoying their evening. The ship's crew went about their duties as if nothing was wrong, but I knew better. I knew what I'd seen. I found my friends at the casino, still glued to the blackjack table, none the wiser to the horrors lurking below deck. I didn't say anything at first. How could I? I wasn't even sure if what I saw was real. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized I couldn't just ignore it. The next day I decided to confront one of the crew members. I waited until I saw a young woman cleaning up after lunch and approached her, trying to keep my voice steady. "Hey, I was exploring last night and went down to the lower decks. I saw something. A man, he looked." Before I could finish, her face went pale and she grabbed my arm, pulling me aside. "You weren't supposed to be down there," she hissed. "That area's off limits for a reason." "What's going on?" I demanded, my heart racing. "Who is that down there?" She glanced around nervously before leaning in closer. "We don't talk about it, all right? The ship, it's old. There's a history here. Things that shouldn't be disturbed. Some of the crew, well, let's just say not everyone makes it through their contract." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. "What do you mean?" She shook her head, her eyes wide with fear. Just stay out of the lower decks, trust me. I didn't push her any further, I didn't need to. Her warning was enough. The rest of the cruise passed in a blur. I couldn't enjoy anything after that, not with the knowledge that there was something wrong with the ship, something that had been buried, hidden below deck, waiting to be discovered. When we finally docked and I stepped off the Ocean Sapphire, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. I didn't look back, didn't say anything to my friends about what had happened. I just wanted to forget, but I can't. The image of that man, with his bloated face and lifeless eyes, still haunts me. Sometimes late at night, I can still smell that faint stench of rot, and hear the sound of water dripping in the dark. I'll never step foot on a cruise ship again. I'm not the kind of guy who gets freaked out easily, but certain things stick with you, that you can't quite explain or forget, no matter how hard you try. What happened to me on that cruise is one of those things. It was supposed to be a break from the usual grind. I'd just broken up with my girlfriend of 5 years, and a friend of mine, David, suggested we book a cruise to the Bahamas. He figured a week of sun, drinks, and no responsibilities would help me shake the funk I'd been in. We boarded the Neptune Majesty on a Saturday afternoon, and the ship was massive, 17 decks, over 3,000 passengers, and countless amenities. It was like a floating city. You could feel the energy from the crowd, people ready to party, and families excited for the vacation of a lifetime. I wasn't exactly in the mood to celebrate, but I was hoping the change of scenery might help. The first couple of days were uneventful. We ate, drank, and hung out by the pool. Nothing out of the ordinary. But then on the third night, I had trouble sleeping. The ship was moving a little rougher than usual, and I found myself lying awake, staring at the ceiling of our cabin, trying to ignore the subtle creaks and groans of the ship. Around 2 a.m., I decided to take a walk to clear my head. I figured most people would be asleep, so I'd have some peace to myself. I left our cabin, telling David not to wait up, and made my way down the long, empty hallway. The ship's nightlights cast long, eerie shadows, but I found the solitude somewhat calming. I wandered around for a while, eventually making my way to one of the upper decks, where the outdoor bar was closed and the chairs were stacked. I liked the stillness of it all. I could hear the waves slapping against the hull, a constant reminder that we were out in the middle of the ocean with nothing around us for miles. That's when I first noticed something strange. As I made my way back toward the elevators, I passed by a row of cabins and heard something, or rather someone, talking behind one of the doors. The voice was low, almost a whisper, but it was frantic, like someone was pleading. It was coming from cabin 438. I stopped, unsure of whether I should listen closer or keep walking. I figured it was probably just a couple arguing or someone talking in their sleep, so I moved on. But as I continued down the hall, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. There was something in that voice that didn't sound right. Maybe it was the desperation in the tone, or maybe it was just my overactive imagination, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. When I got back to the cabin, I told David about what I'd heard. He was half asleep and just mumbled something about how I needed to stop overthinking things. He was probably right. The next morning I pushed the incident out of my mind. We spent the day by the pool, had a few drinks, and even joined in on a trivia game in one of the ship's lounges. I'd almost forgotten about the night before when, as we were heading back to our cabin, I passed by cabin 438 again. There was no sound this time, but the door was slightly ajar. I don't know why, but something compelled me to take a closer look. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was that nagging feeling I'd had the night before. I knocked gently on the door, no response. Pushing the door open a bit more, I peered inside. The lights were off, but the room was lit just enough by the glow from the hallway for me to make out the basics. It was an average cabin, 2 beds, a small desk, and a bathroom door on the left. But something was wrong. One of the beds was perfectly made, like no one had touched it. The other was a mess, with the blankets tangled and thrown aside, like someone had left in a hurry. There was a suitcase in the corner, half unzipped with clothes spilling out. On the desk, I noticed a pile of papers, crumpled, torn, scribbled on. It looked like someone had been furiously writing, or maybe trying to communicate something. As I stepped into the room, my stomach tightened. There was a smell, faint but unmistakable, of salt water and something metallic, like blood. I didn't stay long. The whole situation felt wrong, like I'd stumbled into something I shouldn't have. I backed out of the room and quickly shut the door behind me. That evening, I decided to ask one of the crew members about cabin 438. I approached a young woman who was wiping down tables in the lounge, and casually mentioned that I thought the cabin next to ours was empty, but I'd heard someone inside. The look on her face changed instantly. She seemed uncomfortable, almost nervous. "Cabin 438 is unoccupied," she said firmly, her eyes darting to the side. "No one's been booked in there this trip." I felt a cold wave of unease wash over me. "Are you sure?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Because I heard someone talking in there last night." She hesitated, then lowered her voice. "That cabin hasn't been used in years. After an incident." My heart started racing. "What kind of incident?" She glanced around, then whispered, "About 5 years ago, a passenger disappeared from that cabin. A man. His wife said he'd been acting strange and paranoid. He kept saying there was something wrong with the ship, that someone was watching him. Then, one night, he vanished. They never found his body." She wiped her hands on her apron and stood up. "Please don't mention this to anyone. The crew doesn't like talking about it." I thanked her, but my mind was spinning. I didn't know what to think. That night, as I lay in bed, the quiet of the cabin felt suffocating. Every creak, every whisper of the wind outside felt louder, more menacing. I kept thinking about the empty cabin, the frantic voice I'd heard, and the man who had vanished. At around 3 a.m., I woke up to the sound of knocking. It was coming from the wall between our cabin and 438. Slow, deliberate knocks. 3, then a pause, then 3 more. David was still asleep, oblivious to everything. I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest. The knocking continued, and then beneath it, I heard the same voice from before. Low, frantic, pleading. I couldn't understand the words, but I knew someone was there. Or something. I wanted to get up, to confront whatever was on the other side of that wall, but my body wouldn't move. I was frozen, paralyzed by a fear I hadn't felt since I was a child. The knocking grew louder, more insistent, until suddenly it stopped. The silence that followed was worse. I don't know how long I lay there staring at the wall, but eventually the ship's movements rocked me back into a restless sleep. When we disembarked at the end of the cruise, I made sure not to look back at the ship. David never knew what I'd heard, or what I'd seen. I never told him about the missing man, or the cabin that was supposed to be empty. But I'll never forget the knocking, or the voice on the other side of that wall. There are some things you're better off not knowing, some things you can't explain, and some things you can never forget. I never expected to find myself on a cruise. I'm not a vacation kind of guy, but after working myself into a corner at my job, my sister insisted I take a break. "It's time for you to relax," she said, thrusting 2 cruise tickets into my hands. The cruise was her gift, a 7-day trip along the Mexican Riviera, all expenses paid. She even found a friend willing to join me, a guy named Darren who I'd met a few times at family functions. It wasn't my ideal company, but I was grateful for the gesture. The ship, the Ocean Monarch, was massive. From the outside it looked like a floating city, gleaming white against the blue of the sea. Inside it was a labyrinth of hallways, cabins, and entertainment spaces. The first few days went smoothly enough. Darren and I had fallen into an easy routine, me lounging by the pool with a book, and him spending hours at the ship's casino. It wasn't until the 3rd night that things started to feel off. It began with a weird announcement over the intercom during dinner. "Attention passengers, due to an issue with the engine, there may be intermittent power outages overnight. Please remain in your cabins after midnight for your safety. We apologize for any inconvenience." The captain's voice was calm, but the room seemed to buzz with nervous energy. A murmur of conversation rippled through the dining hall, passengers exchanging concerned glances. Darren shrugged it off, saying it was no big deal. Probably just a precaution. "These things happen," he said, tossing a bread roll into his mouth. I tried to relax, but something about the announcement felt wrong. Ships were supposed to be equipped with backup systems for emergencies. Power outages at sea weren't something to be taken lightly. That night, after Darren headed to the casino again, I decided to explore the ship by myself. I wasn't ready for bed, and the idea of being cooped up in the cabin with no power unsettled me. The ship felt different at night, quieter, darker, with only the faint hum of the ocean to break the silence. I wandered for a while, eventually finding myself near the lower decks. It was a part of the ship reserved for crew members, off limits to passengers. But there was no one around to stop me, and my curiosity got the better of me. I pushed open a door marked Crew Access Only, and descended a narrow stairwell. The air down there was stale, with a slight metallic tang like the scent of rust. I should have turned back then, but something compelled me to keep going. As I walked deeper into the bowels of the ship, I began to hear faint sounds, whispers, shuffling footsteps, the clink of metal. It was odd, but not alarming. I figured it was just crew members working on the engine problem, but the farther I went, the more unsettling the noises became. The whispers grew louder, overlapping in a chaotic hum, like voices trapped in the walls. I stopped when I reached a door at the end of the corridor. It was old and rusted, not like the rest of the ship's modern polished interiors. A chill ran down my spine as I realized how out of place it seemed. Before I could think better of it, I reached for the handle and pulled the door open. What I saw inside didn't make sense. The room was huge, much larger than I expected. It was dimly lit by flickering, yellowed lights hanging from the ceiling. The walls were lined with old machinery, pipes, valves, and gears that looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. The air was thick with dust, and the floor was slick with oil and water. But what caught my attention were the objects scattered around the room. There were old suitcases, trunks, and personal belongings, all covered in grime. Some of the items looked like they had been there for years: rusted watches, moldy clothes, broken eyeglasses. I picked up a framed photograph from the floor. It showed a family, smiling, standing on a dock with the ship in the background. The picture looked ancient, the edges curling and yellowed with age. I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin as I realized something disturbing. None of this belonged on the Ocean Monarch. These were relics, artifacts from another time. A sudden noise behind me made me jump. I spun around to see a figure standing in the doorway watching me. At first, I thought it was Darren, or maybe a crew member who had followed me. But the figure didn't move. It just stood there, a shadowy silhouette against the dim light of the corridor. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. The figure didn't respond. It stepped forward, just enough for me to see its face, or what should have been its face. Instead, it was a blur, like the features had been smudged away, leaving only hollow indentations where the eyes and mouth should be. My heart raced. I backed away, my foot catching on one of the suitcases. The figure moved closer, its movements slow and unnatural, like it was being pulled on strings. I bolted for the door, slamming it shut behind me as I ran back down the corridor, my footsteps echoing in the narrow space. The whispers were louder now, more insistent, like they were following me. I didn't stop running until I was back on the main deck, the fresh air hitting me like a slap in the face. I leaned against the railing, gasping for breath, my mind racing. What the hell had I just seen? Was it some kind of hallucination, or had I stumbled into something I wasn't supposed to? When I finally made it back to the cabin, Darren was already there, half asleep on the bed. I didn't tell him what had happened. I couldn't even explain it to myself. The next morning, I tried to shake off the experience. Maybe it had been a trick of the light, or maybe I was just overtired. But when we went down for breakfast, I overheard two passengers talking about strange occurrences during the night. One woman said she had heard voices outside her cabin, whispering her name. Another man claimed to have seen a shadowy figure in the hallway, watching him as he slept. My heart sank. The rest of the cruise passed in a blur of paranoia. I couldn't stop thinking about the figure in the lower decks, about the strange objects I'd found in that forgotten room. Every night, I lay awake in my cabin, listening for the faint whispers I had heard below deck, dreading the possibility that something, someone, might be standing outside our door. On the last night of the cruise, the ship's power went out completely. Darren was snoring next to me, but I was wide awake, staring at the ceiling in the pitch-black cabin. The air felt heavy and thick with an unseen presence. I could hear soft footsteps outside the door, and then a faint knock, so quiet I almost didn't hear it. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The knock came again, louder this time. The door handle rattled, and then everything went silent. When the lights flickered back on a few minutes later, I rushed to the door and yanked it open. The hallway was empty, but on the floor, just outside our cabin, was an old suitcase. It looked just like the ones I had seen in the room below deck, dusty, rusted, and forgotten. I didn't open it. I couldn't. When we finally disembarked the next morning, I didn't look back at the ship. I didn't need to. Whatever I had seen down in those forgotten corridors, whatever had knocked on my door that night, it didn't belong to the Ocean Monarch. And neither did I. I've always loved the sea. There's something about the vastness, the endless horizon, that gives me a sense of peace. So when my girlfriend Emily and I booked a week-long cruise to the Caribbean, I was thrilled. It was supposed to be a dream vacation, a break from our mundane lives, a chance to recharge. We were both excited for the warm beaches, luxurious dinners, and days spent lounging by the pool. The ship, the Golden Dawn, was enormous. You could get lost just walking from one end to the other. It had everything you could imagine: multiple pools, restaurants, a casino, and even a small theater. It was easy to forget that we were on a ship in the middle of the ocean. Most of the passengers seemed content to soak up the sun and indulge in the all-you-can-eat buffets. Emily and I were no different. The first few days passed without incident. We sunbathed, drank tropical cocktails, and gorged ourselves on buffet food. Everything was perfect, until the fourth night. It started with a strange announcement over the ship's intercom. Just as we were finishing dinner in the main dining hall, the captain's voice crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We are experiencing some unexpected navigational issues. Nothing to be alarmed about, but we will be altering our course temporarily. Please remain calm, and continue to enjoy your evening." The message was vague and unsettling, but we brushed it off. Emily joked that the captain had probably had a little too much to drink. We laughed, clinking our wine glasses, and returned to our meal. But later that night, things got weirder. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of heavy footsteps above us. It was odd, considering our cabin was on one of the upper decks. There shouldn't have been anyone above us. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, like someone was pacing back and forth. I nudged Emily awake. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. She groaned and pulled the blanket over her head. "It's probably just some drunk guy stumbling around." But the footsteps continued, steady and rhythmic, for what felt like an eternity. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I got out of bed, pulled on some clothes, and decided to check it out. Emily muttered something about me being paranoid but didn't stop me from leaving. When I stepped into the hallway, it was eerily quiet. The lights were dimmed for the night, casting long, flickering shadows on the walls. I made my way up the stairwell to the top deck, where the sound had been coming from. The air was cold and heavy, the ocean around us pitch black as if the ship was drifting through a void. And then I saw it, another ship. It was off to the port side, barely visible through the thick mist that seemed to have settled over the ocean. The ship was old, its silhouette dark and looming. It didn't have any lights, and it wasn't moving. It just floated there, silent and still. I blinked, rubbing my eyes, wondering if I was seeing things. But no, it was there. And as I watched, I saw something that made my skin crawl. There were people on the deck of the other ship. Dozens of them, standing motionless, their figures barely distinguishable in the fog. They were facing us, staring directly at the Golden Dawn. I stood frozen, trying to make sense of it. Why was there another ship so close to us? Why were these people just standing there, not moving? I wanted to run back to my cabin and wake Emily, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the sight. Suddenly the ship's horn blared, startling me. It wasn't the Golden Dawn's horn, it came from the other ship. The sound was deep, mournful, and echoed across the water, sending a shiver down my spine. I stumbled backward, my heart racing, and as I did, the fog seemed to swallow the ship whole. One moment, it was there. The next, it was gone. I stood on the deck for a long time, staring at the space where the ship had been. Eventually, I returned to the cabin, trying to convince myself that it had just been a trick of the light. maybe some weird optical illusion. But the image of those people standing on the deck staring at me wouldn't leave my mind. The next morning I told Emily what I'd seen. She was skeptical, of course. "You probably just had a weird dream," she said. "Or maybe you were sleepwalking." But I knew I hadn't imagined it. The ship had been real, and those people, whoever they were, had been real too. As the day went on, the mood aboard the Golden Dawn began to shift. Passengers were complaining about strange noises during the night, footsteps, knocking on their doors, even whispers in their cabins. Some said they had seen shadowy figures at the end of the hallways, only to have them disappear when they got closer. The staff tried to calm everyone down, insisting it was just the ship creaking or the wind playing tricks on us, but it was clear that something was wrong. That night, as we were getting ready for bed, there was a knock on our cabin door. It was faint but distinct. Emily and I both froze. "Who could that be?" she asked, her voice shaking. I didn't answer. Instead, I slowly walked to the door and peered through the peephole. No one was there. I opened the door and stepped into the hallway, but it was empty. The air felt colder than usual, and I could feel the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I was about to go back inside when I noticed something strange, wet footprints leading down the hall. They were bare, human footprints, and they glistened in the dim light as if someone had just walked through water. The trail led toward the stairwell at the far end of the corridor. I hesitated, but something inside me compelled me to follow. I traced the footprints down several flights of stairs, my heart pounding harder with each step. They led to one of the lower decks, a part of the ship I hadn't explored before. As I reached the bottom, I noticed the smell, salt, mixed with something foul, like rotting seaweed. The footprints ended at a large rusted metal door. It was slightly ajar. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The room beyond was dark, damp, and filled with the sound of dripping water. It looked like some kind of storage area, long forgotten by the crew. But what I saw in the center of the room made my blood run cold. There, standing in a pool of water, were the same figures I had seen on the deck of the other ship. They were gaunt, their skin pale and bloated, their eyes hollow and black. They didn't move, but I could feel their gaze on me. I stumbled back, my mind racing. This couldn't be real. It had to be some kind of nightmare. But the cold air, the smell, the way their eyes followed me, it was all too real. I turned and ran, not stopping until I was back in the safety of our cabin. I locked the door behind me and collapsed on the bed, gasping for breath. I didn't tell Emily about what I'd seen. She wouldn't have believed me anyway. The next morning, the captain made another announcement. Due to unforeseen circumstances, the cruise was ending early. We were turning back to port. I didn't need to be told twice. As soon as we docked, I practically sprinted off the ship, not daring to look back. I still don't know what I saw on that cruise. I've tried to rationalize it, to tell myself it was just my imagination, but every time I close my eyes, I see those figures standing there, waiting. When I booked the cruise, I was looking for solitude. I'd just gone through a rough breakup, and the idea of being in the middle of the ocean, disconnected from the world, was exactly what I needed. I wanted peace, no texts, no social media, just the sea, and a good book. It was a smaller cruise line, not one of those massive party ships. The brochure promised a quiet, intimate experience, with only a few hundred passengers on board. Perfect. The ship, the Stellar Horizon, was beautiful in an old-fashioned way. Sleek white exterior, polished wood decks, and staff that treated you like royalty. The first couple of days were exactly what I needed. I'd wake up to the sound of waves, sip coffee while staring out at the endless blue, and spend the day lounging, reading, and losing myself in the gentle sway of the ship. But something changed on the third night. I was out on one of the upper decks enjoying the stars. It was quiet, with most of the passengers either at the ship's small bar or in their cabins. As I leaned against the railing, I noticed something odd. Far in the distance, barely visible, was another ship. It wasn't moving. At first I figured it was just some other cruise liner on a similar route, but the longer I watched, the stranger it seemed. It was too close. We were in the middle of the ocean, far from any major shipping lanes, and the ship itself looked old, like something out of a black and white photograph, with tall, outdated smokestacks and a dull, rusted exterior. The eerie thing was, there were no lights on it, not a single one. I stood there, staring at it, trying to figure out if my eyes were playing tricks on me. It felt like I was looking at a ghost. After a few minutes, I realized the ship was slowly getting closer. It wasn't moving in any noticeable way. No engines, no sound. But it was drifting toward us. I left the deck, feeling uneasy, and went back to my cabin. The image of that ship stayed with me though. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The next morning, I asked one of the staff about it. She gave me a confused look and said there hadn't been any ships nearby. She assured me that the captain would have been aware of any vessels in the area, and that we were sailing in open waters. I tried to shrug it off as some weird optical illusion, but the anxiety lingered. That night, I found myself back on the same deck, almost compelled to look for the ship again. I wasn't surprised when I saw it, this time much closer than before. It was drifting alongside us, still without any lights, its rusted hull barely visible in the moonlight. My stomach dropped. I couldn't explain why, but the sight of that ship filled me with dread. I wasn't alone on the deck this time. A man in his 50s, wearing a Hawaiian shirt and cargo shorts, was standing a few feet away from me, staring out at the horizon. I walked over, thinking I'd ask if he'd seen the ship too. But when I got closer, I realized something was wrong. He wasn't looking at the horizon. He was looking at the water. I followed his gaze and saw what had his attention. A body floating face down in the water, not far from our ship. I stumbled back in shock, but the man didn't react. He just stood there, fixated on the body, his face expressionless. "What the hell?" I muttered, my voice trembling. The man finally turned to look at me, and when he did, his eyes were hollow, almost lifeless. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no sound came out. Then, without warning, he walked to the edge of the deck and climbed over the railing. I screamed, lunging forward to stop him, but it was too late. He fell silently into the water, disappearing into the dark waves below. My heart pounded in my chest as I frantically looked around, hoping someone else had seen it happen, but the deck was empty. Panicked, I ran to the nearest crew member and told them what had just happened. They immediately alerted the captain, and within minutes, the ship was brought to a halt. A search team was sent out, but they found nothing. Nobody, no sign of the man. It was like he had never been there. When I described him, the crew seemed confused. They said no one matching his description was on the passenger list. I barely slept that night. I kept thinking about the body in the water, the man's empty eyes, and the ship that had been drifting closer every night. Something was wrong here, and I needed to know what. The following day, I overheard some of the other passengers talking about strange occurrences. One woman mentioned seeing people walking on the lower decks late at night, people who didn't seem like passengers. Another man claimed to have heard distant music, like an old gramophone playing. But when he tried to find the source, there was nothing. The more I listened, the more it became clear. I wasn't the only one experiencing strange things on this ship. That night, I made a decision. I was going to find out what was going on. I waited until after midnight, then headed back to the upper deck. The ship was there again, closer than ever, its rusted hull almost scraping against the side of our ship. I climbed over the railing, not to jump, but to get a better look. The water between the two ships was eerily still, like it was waiting. I peered down, trying to see if there were any signs of life on the other vessel. Then, I saw them. Figures, shadowy and indistinct, standing on the deck of the other ship. They were staring at me, their faces featureless, their bodies swaying slightly as if caught in a gentle breeze that didn't exist. I froze, unable to move, as they raised their arms in unison, pointing at me. Suddenly I felt something cold wrap around my ankle. I looked down and saw a pale hand reaching up from the water, grasping at me with an unnatural strength. I screamed and kicked, trying to shake it off, but more hands emerged, clawing at the railing, pulling themselves up from the depths. They were climbing onto our ship. I scrambled back over the railing, running toward the interior of the ship, my heart racing. Behind me I could hear the wet, slapping sounds of feet on the deck as they followed me. I didn't stop until I reached my cabin, slamming the door behind me and locking it. The noises outside faded, but I knew they were still out there, waiting. By morning, I was ready to get off the ship. But when I checked the itinerary, I realized we were still days away from the next port. The crew didn't believe my story, and the passengers who had seen strange things were starting to disappear, either keeping to themselves or simply gone. I'm writing this now from my cabin, trying to stay calm, but I can hear the tapping on the walls. It's getting closer. The ship has stopped moving, and outside my window, I can see the other ship, now directly beside us. I don't think it's drifting anymore. I think it's waiting. It was supposed to be a relaxing escape, a break from the grind of everyday life. My girlfriend Sarah and I had been looking forward to this cruise for months. We needed it. A full week on the ocean, away from work, phones, and the never-ending chaos of life. I was excited about the sun, the drinks, and the food. Sarah, well, she loved the idea of simply being able to breathe in the sea air and spend time together. The ship we boarded was massive, one of those luxury cruise liners that look like a floating city. Everything about it screamed excess: opulent dining rooms, glitzy casinos, endless buffets. It was the kind of place you'd expect to feel a little lost in, but that was part of the charm. We spent the first couple of days doing typical tourist stuff, swimming, sunbathing, and drinking cocktails by the pool. It felt perfect, almost too perfect. The only thing that stood out to me was how quiet the ship felt. Sure, there were plenty of people, but it seemed like we rarely bumped into anyone. Hallways were often empty, and the massive deck felt eerily spacious for the number of passengers that were supposed to be on board. On the third night, something strange happened. Sarah and I had gone to bed early, exhausted from a day of snorkeling and exploring one of the tropical islands we had docked at. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to a sound. A faint, rhythmic tapping. At first I thought it was just part of the ship, maybe something with the engine. But the tapping grew louder and more persistent. It was coming from the hallway outside our cabin. I shook Sarah awake. "Do you hear that?" Groggy, she listened. "Yeah, what is it?" "I'm not sure. It sounds like someone walking up and down the hallway." She frowned. "At this hour?" I got up and opened the cabin door, peeking into the hallway. It was empty, but the tapping continued. Not footsteps. More like something metal striking the floor. It sounded almost deliberate. I stepped out into the hallway, trying to locate the source. The ship's lights flickered faintly overhead, and the tapping seemed to move further down the hall. I followed, keeping my distance but curious enough to want to figure it out. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the tapping stopped. Silence, complete and unsettling. When I returned to the cabin, Sarah was already asleep again. I didn't mention the incident in the morning. No sense in spooking her over what was probably nothing more than a maintenance worker. But the following night, it happened again. This time, it woke both of us. The tapping, the same rhythm echoed down the hallway. Sarah sat up, her eyes wide. "That's the same noise from last night." "I know," I said, pulling on a shirt. "I'm going to find out what it is." "Wait, don't go alone," she said, grabbing my arm. "It's weird, right? It doesn't sound like a normal noise." I nodded, a growing sense of unease tightening in my chest. I hadn't wanted to admit it the night before, but something about the tapping felt wrong, like it was meant for us to hear it. Still, I couldn't just sit there. Together, Sarah and I ventured out into the hallway, the tapping louder now. It echoed off the steel walls, creating an eerie reverberation that made my skin crawl. We walked slowly, cautiously. The ship was dark, with only the dim emergency lights casting long shadows along the corridor. As we turned a corner, we froze. At the far end of the hall stood a man. His back was to us, and he was leaning on something, a cane it looked like. He was tall and thin, his posture hunched. The tapping sound came from him as he slowly lifted the cane and tapped it against the floor, over and over. Sarah gripped my arm tightly. "Who is that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know," I said, my heart pounding in my chest. We took a step closer, and as we did, the man suddenly stopped tapping. He stood still, unnervingly, before slowly turning his head to look at us. His face was pale, almost ghostly, with deep-set eyes that seemed to stare right through us. There was something deeply unsettling about him. Something not right. Then, without a word, he turned and walked down the hallway, his cane tapping rhythmically again. I wanted to follow, but Sarah pulled me back. "No, let's go back to the cabin, please," I didn't argue. We rushed back and locked the door behind us, our hearts racing. For the rest of the night, we lay in bed, too afraid to sleep. The tapping echoed in my mind long after it had stopped. The next morning, I went to the front desk and asked about the man we had seen. The staff looked confused, telling me there was no one on board matching that description. When I asked if they had any elderly passengers or anyone using a cane, they shook their heads. I even brought up the tapping noise, but they dismissed it, saying it was likely the ship's natural creaks and groans. But I knew it wasn't. Sarah knew it too. The following night, the tapping returned, louder than before. It wasn't just in the hallway this time. It seemed to come from all around us, like the sound was inside the walls. We stayed inside the cabin, too terrified to leave, but we could hear it, the relentless tapping, like it was getting closer. At one point, Sarah swore she heard whispering, soft, unintelligible voices, but I couldn't make it out. It was like the ship itself was alive, conspiring against us. We barely slept that night, and when we woke up, Sarah made a chilling discovery. On the small vanity in the corner of our cabin, someone had carved a message into the wood. 3 words, "Last passenger soon." We packed our bags immediately. We tried to leave the ship early, but we were out at sea, days away from the nearest port. I demanded to speak with the captain, but the crew insisted everything was fine, even as we told them about the man, the tapping, and the message. Their dismissiveness was infuriating, but there was nothing we could do. For the next 2 days, we stayed in the most populated areas of the ship, refusing to be alone in the cabin. The tapping didn't follow us, but the sense of dread never left. We avoided the hallways at night and made sure we were always surrounded by other people. Finally, the cruise came to an end. When we docked, Sarah and I were the first off the ship. As we disembarked, I couldn't help but glance back at the vessel. There, standing on the deck, was the man with the cane, watching us leave. I haven't been on a cruise since. I had always been a sucker for cheap vacations, and when my friend Mark found a last-minute deal for a week-long cruise at half the price, I was all in. The brochure made it sound like a dream: luxury cabins, gourmet dining, endless entertainment, and views of the most beautiful waters in the world. It was an all-inclusive package, and I couldn't pass it up. It was a massive ship, a floating city of sorts, the SS Ocean Mirage. As soon as we stepped on board, it felt surreal. Marble floors, chandeliers, and massive glass windows gave you a glimpse of the never-ending ocean. Mark and I, along with 2 other friends, Jenny and Mike, were hyped for the vacation. We spent the first day lounging by the pool, enjoying the buffets and exploring the ship's many amenities. There was something for everyone: piano bars, a casino, even a small theater for nightly shows. But there was one thing that caught my attention that evening. While wandering around, I noticed a section of the ship that seemed oddly desolate. I'm talking about Deck 13. Yeah, the ship had a 13th deck, something cruise ships usually avoid for superstition reasons. The doors leading to that deck were locked, but there was something off about them. I couldn't quite explain it at the time, just a weird, unsettling vibe. I brought it up to Mark over dinner. "Dude, don't tell me you're getting all superstitious about Deck 13, he laughed, shoveling down his pasta. "It's probably just some maintenance area or something. You're overthinking it." But that feeling didn't go away. That night, we decided to check out one of the ship's nightclubs. It was a fun time, but I couldn't shake the weird vibe I had earlier. So, around midnight, I left the others, and told them I'd meet them back at the cabin. I wanted to explore the ship some more, but deep down, I knew I wanted to see Deck 13 again. It was like something was pulling me toward it. I made my way back to the area and found the doors again. I hesitated. Why would they lock off an entire deck on a ship like this? Out of curiosity, I pressed my ear against the door. At first I heard nothing but the distant hum of the ship's engines. Then, I heard something else, whispering. At least, I think it was whispering. It was faint, like it was coming from the other side of the door, but I couldn't make out any distinct words. My pulse quickened. Rationality told me to walk away, but curiosity kept me rooted in place. Then, as if by some unseen force, the door clicked open. No one was there. The hallway beyond was dimly lit, with flickering lights that led into darkness. I stepped inside. The air felt heavy, like stepping into a sauna, but there was no heat. The smell was what hit me next, damp, musty, like the air had been trapped for years. My footsteps echoed down the hall, and I could hear the ship creaking around me. It was odd because on the rest of the ship, the background noise was always a constant mix of music, chatter, and the ocean breeze. But here, it was silent. Deathly silent. As I ventured deeper, I noticed that the doors on this deck were different from the others. They weren't numbered like the rooms on the rest of the ship. These doors had names carved into them: James R., Angela W., Marcus F., the list went on. I didn't recognize any of them, but they all sent a shiver down my spine. They looked old, like they'd been here for decades. I tried to open one of the doors, locked. Suddenly there was a noise from further down the hall, a thump, like something heavy had fallen. I froze. My heart was pounding now. I wasn't alone down here. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. No answer. I debated turning around and leaving, but before I could decide, I heard it again. The whispering, louder this time, more distinct, like a group of people talking in low tones. I couldn't make out any words, but it was coming from behind the door marked Eleanor S. I reached for the handle. It turned. The door creaked open, revealing a small, dimly lit room. Inside there was a single bed, an old wooden dresser, and a round mirror on the wall. The air was freezing, and I could see my breath. The whispers stopped the moment I stepped inside. My instincts screamed for me to leave, but I was frozen in place. Then, I saw it. In the mirror, a woman was standing behind me. Pale skin, dark sunken eyes, her mouth twisted into a grimace. Her hair was wet, like she'd just come out of the ocean. I spun around, but there was no one there. I looked back in the mirror, and she was gone. A chill ran down my spine. I bolted out of the room and back down the hall, not daring to look behind me. The whispers had started up again, louder now, almost frantic. I didn't stop running until I was back at the door leading to the main part of the ship. I yanked it open and stumbled through, slamming it shut behind me. Breathless, I leaned against the wall, trying to calm down. I didn't know what I had just seen. Hell, I didn't want to know. But I knew one thing for sure. I was never going back to Deck 13. I didn't tell anyone what had happened. Not even Mark. I couldn't explain it, and I didn't want them to think I'd lost it. But something changed after that night. The ship didn't feel as welcoming anymore. There was tension in the air, like the ship itself was watching me. The next few days passed in a blur. I tried to enjoy the rest of the trip, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I avoided Deck 13, but I could still hear the whispers sometimes, faint and distant, as if they were calling me back. On the final night of the cruise, I was sitting out on the deck, staring at the water. It was calm, almost too calm. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw her. The woman from the mirror, standing at the edge of the ship, staring out at the ocean. I blinked, and she was gone. I didn't sleep that night. When we docked the next morning, I was the first off the ship. As soon as my feet touched solid ground, I felt a weight lift off my chest. I don't know what happened on that ship, and I don't want to know. But I do know this: some doors are meant to stay closed, and some things are better left unexplored. I never went on another cruise again. I had always dreamed of taking a luxury cruise, and when I finally had the chance, I couldn't believe my luck. My name is Alex, and I have just turned 30. I was excited to celebrate my milestone birthday on the lavish Ocean Majesty, a massive cruise ship boasting every possible amenity. The reviews raved about its opulence, and I was looking forward to spending a week in paradise. The first few days were everything I had hoped for. The ship was enormous, with multiple decks filled with gourmet restaurants, a casino, and even an indoor pool. My cabin was comfortable, with a balcony that overlooked the vast ocean. It was the perfect escape from my usual routine, and I was relishing every moment. On the third night, things began to shift. The ship was docked at a small tropical island. After a day of exploring, I returned to the ship exhausted but content. The evening started well enough. There was a themed party in the grand ballroom, and I mingled with fellow passengers. The atmosphere was festive, and I lost track of time. It was well past midnight when I decided to call it a night. As I made my way to my cabin, I noticed that the corridors were unusually quiet. It wasn't uncommon for the ship to be a bit quieter at night, but tonight felt eerily silent. The usual hum of activity was replaced by an unsettling stillness. I brushed it off, thinking it was just the quiet of the night. When I reached my cabin, I fumbled with the key card before finally unlocking the door. To my surprise, the room was unusually cold. I turned up the thermostat, not thinking much of it, and went to bed. However, as I was drifting off to sleep, I was suddenly jolted awake by a strange noise. It sounded like a door creaking open and closed repeatedly. I listened intently, trying to locate the source of the noise. It seemed to be coming from the hallway outside my cabin. I got out of bed and cracked open the door, peering into the darkened corridor. Nothing was visible, but the noise continued intermittently. I figured it was probably just another passenger or crew member, so I went back to bed. The next morning, I woke up feeling unusually groggy. I brushed it off as a side effect of the disrupted sleep and went about my day. As I was enjoying breakfast, I overheard a conversation between two other passengers. They were talking about strange occurrences on the ship, doors opening and closing by themselves, flickering lights, and inexplicable cold spots. I dismissed it as an overactive imagination. Later that day, the ship set sail again. As night approached, I began to feel a sense of unease. The previously calm and enjoyable cruise now seemed to carry an ominous air. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I decided to take a walk around the deck to clear my head. While wandering, I stumbled upon a part of the ship I hadn't explored before. It was a deserted deck with a few scattered lounge chairs and a large old-fashioned lifeboat. I approached the lifeboat and noticed something strange. There was an old rusty latch on the side that seemed out of place. Curiosity got the better of me, and I unlatched it, revealing a hidden compartment beneath. Inside there was a small dusty journal. The cover was faded, and the pages were yellowed with age. I picked it up and began to read. The entries were cryptic and disturbing. They detailed strange occurrences on the ship, with mentions of a vanishing deck where passengers would disappear without a trace. As I read on, I found myself growing more uneasy. The final entry was dated exactly 50 years ago, and ended abruptly with a single sentence: "They're coming for us." My thoughts were interrupted by a sudden chill that swept over me. I looked up to see that the sky had turned dark, and the ocean seemed unnervingly calm. The eerie silence was broken only by the distant sound of the ship's horn. I decided to head back to my cabin, clutching the journal tightly. When I returned, I found my cabin door slightly ajar. I was sure I had closed it properly earlier. Hesitant, I pushed the door open and entered. Everything appeared to be in order, but the coldness was even more pronounced. I tried to shake off my growing anxiety and settled in for the night. As I lay in bed, the strange noises returned: creaking doors, faint whispers, and an unsettling feeling of being watched. I tried to ignore it, but sleep eluded me. I eventually got up and checked the corridors again, but there was no one in sight. Around 3 a.m., I heard a knock at my cabin door. It was strange, as I wasn't expecting anyone. I hesitated but eventually opened it. Standing outside was a crew member I didn't recognize. He was wearing a worn, old-fashioned uniform that didn't match the modern attire of the ship's crew. He looked disheveled, and had a vacant expression. "Are you lost?" I asked. The man didn't respond. Instead, he stared at me blankly and then pointed down the hallway. Without a word, he turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing in the empty corridor. I followed him, feeling a growing sense of dread. The crew member led me to a secluded part of the ship I had never seen before. The hallway was dimly lit and seemed to stretch on endlessly. As we walked, I noticed that the doors along the corridor were all slightly ajar. Each room I glanced into was empty, and coated in a layer of dust. Eventually, the crew member stopped in front of a door marked "Storage." He motioned for me to enter. I hesitated, but pushed the door open. Inside was a small, cluttered room filled with old ship equipment and boxes. In the corner of the room was an old-fashioned nautical chart. I approached the chart and noticed something disturbing. It depicted a part of the ship that didn't match the current layout. There was a section labeled Vanishing Deck, with an ominous warning written in red ink, "Do not enter." My anxiety reached a peak as I turned around to find the crew member had vanished. I felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of danger. I fled the room and ran back to my cabin. The eerie silence of the ship was now deafening. I locked my cabin door, and, unable to sleep, sat awake all night. The next morning, I reported the strange encounter to the ship's management. They assured me that there was no such area on the ship and dismissed my concerns as a misunderstanding. As the cruise continued, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread. The unsettling atmosphere persisted, and I found myself increasingly on edge. I never saw the mysterious crew member again and never mentioned the journal to anyone. When the cruise finally ended, I was relieved to return to solid ground. The experience left me with a lingering sense of unease. I never did find out what happened on that ship, or who the mysterious crew member was. The Vanishing Deck remained a chilling mystery, and I couldn't help but wonder if it was a dark secret the ship's management would prefer to keep hidden. The memory of that cruise continues to haunt me, and I can't help but feel that something sinister lurks in the deep, waiting for its next chance to emerge from the shadows. When I booked the week-long cruise aboard the Ocean Serenity, I envisioned nothing but paradise. The itinerary promised stops at tropical islands, fine dining, and days spent basking under the sun. It was supposed to be my escape, a break from the stress of my life as a corporate accountant. Little did I know that this trip would turn into a living nightmare. I boarded the ship in Miami, along with hundreds of other passengers. The atmosphere was lively, filled with the excitement of vacationers eager to leave the mainland behind. As we set sail, the warm breeze from the Atlantic felt like the start of something great. The first 2 days were pure bliss, endless buffets, pools, and cocktails under the sun. I even made a few friends, striking up conversations with fellow passengers during dinners and at the ship's bars. It wasn't until the third night that things began to feel off. I had gone to bed early that night, wanting to catch a sunrise yoga session the next morning. Sometime after midnight, I woke up suddenly. At first I thought it was nothing more than a bad dream, but then I noticed it. The silence. The usual hum of the ship's engine, and the faint sounds of late-night partiers had disappeared. I sat up in bed listening, but all I could hear was the faint sound of water slapping against the hull. Feeling uneasy, I threw on a jacket and decided to step out onto the balcony of my cabin. The ocean stretched endlessly into the night, black as ink under the overcast sky. No stars, no moon, just a thick, oppressive darkness. A cold breeze swept across the deck, making me shiver. Something didn't feel right. I glanced at my watch, 1:47 a.m. The ship felt dead, like it had stopped moving altogether. I stepped back inside and flicked on the light, but nothing happened. The power was out. My unease grew, and I decided to leave my cabin to see if anyone else was experiencing the same issue. The hallway outside was empty and dark, with only the dim emergency lights casting eerie shadows along the corridor. I walked toward the elevators, but they weren't functioning either. I continued down the hall, heading for the main lobby where the guest services desk was located. When I got there, the lobby was deserted. The usual bustle of staff and guests was gone, replaced by a deafening stillness. The front desk was unstaffed, and not a single person was in sight. I checked the time again, 2:15 a.m. Normally, even at this hour, a few people were milling about, but now, nothing. I considered going back to my cabin, but something told me I needed to figure out what was happening. I walked toward the dining area, thinking maybe the late-night buffet was still open, but when I reached the doors, they were locked. I turned back, my sense of unease growing with every step. Then, I heard it, a faint whispering sound, like hushed voices coming from the lower decks. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but the tone was unsettling, almost like a chant. I followed the sound, descending the staircase that led to the crew quarters and maintenance areas. The further I went, the louder the whispering became. When I reached the lowest deck, the whispers stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was deafening. The air felt heavy, thick with something I couldn't quite name. I turned the corner, and that's when I saw them. A group of passengers, at least a dozen, were gathered in the middle of the hallway, standing perfectly still. Their heads were bowed, and they were all facing the same direction, toward a large metal door at the far end of the hall. None of them moved. None of them spoke. "Hey!" I called out, my voice echoing in the narrow corridor. "What's going on? Why are you down here?" No one answered. I took a cautious step forward, my mind racing to make sense of what I was seeing. As I got closer, I noticed something strange. The passengers, some of whom I recognized from earlier in the week, were all holding hands, their fingers intertwined in a tight grip. Their faces were pale, almost as if they were in a trance. And then I saw it, their eyes. They were open, but blank, completely white, as if they were blind or dead. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. This couldn't be real. I blinked, half expecting them to disappear when I opened my eyes again, but they were still there, standing in that unnerving silence. Suddenly, the metal door at the end of the hall creaked open, slowly at first, then swinging wide with a loud clang. Beyond it, there was nothing but darkness. I felt a cold wind rush from the doorway, carrying with it a low guttural sound that sent chills down my spine. It was like a growl, deep and menacing, coming from somewhere far beyond the ship. Without warning, the passengers began to move. Still holding hands, they started walking toward the open door, their steps synchronized and deliberate. I wanted to scream, to shout at them to stop, but my voice caught in my throat. All I could do was watch as they marched into the darkness, disappearing one by one. And then, just as the last person passed through, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. The hallway was empty again, but the air still felt wrong. I didn't stick around to find out what would happen next. I turned and bolted back up the stairs, my legs trembling as I ran. By the time I reached the upper decks, I was gasping for breath. The ship was still eerily quiet, but as I made my way back to my cabin, I noticed something odd. The lights were on again, the familiar hum of the engine had returned, and there were people in the halls, chatting and laughing as if nothing had happened. I stopped a passing crew member and asked him if there had been a power outage, but he just looked at me like I was crazy. "No, sir. Everything's been running smoothly all night. Is there something wrong with your cabin?" I didn't know how to respond. I mumbled something about not feeling well and headed back to my room. Once inside, I locked the door and sat on the edge of the bed, trying to make sense of what I'd just witnessed. The next morning, I asked a few passengers if they had noticed anything strange during the night, but no one seemed to know what I was talking about. I even checked the lower decks, but the metal door and the strange passengers were gone, as if they had never been there. For the rest of the cruise, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I kept expecting to hear the whispers again, or to see those lifeless eyes staring back at me from the shadows. But nothing else happened. The ship docked in Miami at the end of the week, and we all disembarked as if it had been a perfectly normal vacation. But I know what I saw. And I know that somewhere, deep in the bowels of that ship, something waits. Something dark, and ancient, and hungry. When I boarded the Horizon Dream, I thought I was in for a relaxing getaway. It was a luxury cruise, a week-long escape through the pristine waters of the Pacific. I'd been saving up for it, eager to disconnect from work and daily stress. But if I'd known what was going to happen, I would have never stepped foot on that ship. The first few days were perfect. The weather was warm, the seas calm. The ship itself was incredible. Endless buffets, live shows, even an open-air cinema on the upper deck. The passengers were all friendly enough, but I preferred to keep to myself. There was something about being on the open ocean, surrounded by nothing but miles of water, that made me feel peaceful. Little did I know, that isolation would soon turn into something much more terrifying. By the fourth day, we had traveled far from any land. The captain announced that we were heading into deeper waters, farther from any port. That night, I decided to visit the observation deck. It was supposed to be a spot for stargazing, away from the noise and lights of the main areas. I grabbed a drink from the bar and made my way up, eager to have some quiet time under the stars. The observation deck was deserted when I arrived. It was a small space, with only a few chairs and some large glass windows that gave a panoramic view of the ocean. I sat down, sipping my drink, and looking out at the black water. There was no moon, and the stars reflected dimly off the surface, giving the scene an eerie, almost surreal quality. As I sat there, I started to hear something strange. It was faint at first, a soft creaking sound, like the ship's hull settling. But then it got louder, a deep, rhythmic groan, as if the ship itself was straining against the pressure of the water. I figured it was just the usual sounds of a massive vessel at sea, but the noise unsettled me. Then I saw it, something moving in the water, far off in the distance. It was hard to make out, just a dark shape cutting through the waves. At first, I thought it was a whale or a large school of fish, but as it got closer, I realized it was moving too deliberately for that. It was massive, easily the size of a small ship, and it was heading straight for us. I stood up, my eyes fixed on the dark shape. It was still too far away to make out any details, but I could feel a sense of dread building in my chest. Something about it was wrong. The way it moved, smooth, silent, didn't fit with anything I'd ever seen on the ocean before. The sound of the ship groaning grew louder, and the dark shape disappeared beneath the surface. I stared out into the water, waiting for it to reappear, but the sea remained calm. After a few minutes I convinced myself that it had just been my imagination, maybe a trick of the light. I decided to head back to my cabin, figuring a good night's sleep would clear my head. But sleep didn't come easily that night. I kept hearing the creaking, the groaning of the ship, louder now, almost as if something was pressing against the hull. I tried to ignore it, but the noise became impossible to block out. Just as I was about to get up and investigate, I heard a knock on my door. It was a strange sound, soft at first, but then more insistent. I assumed it was a crew member, maybe checking to see if I needed anything. But when I opened the door, there was no one there. The hallway was empty, eerily quiet. I shut the door, my unease growing. I tried to brush it off, but then the knocking came again, louder this time. I rushed to the door, yanking it open. Again, no one. I stepped out into the hall, looking both ways, but there was no sign of anyone. I could still hear the creaking and groaning, echoing through the walls of the ship. It felt like the whole vessel was alive, like something was moving within its walls, deep beneath the surface. I decided to go to the front desk, to ask if anyone else had heard the noises. Maybe there was an issue with the ship, or maybe I was just losing my mind. But as I walked through the ship, I noticed something odd. The lights were dimmer than usual, flickering in and out. The once lively halls were empty, and the usually bustling bars and restaurants were now closed and silent. When I reached the front desk, there was no one there. Not a single crew member in sight. I called out, but my voice echoed in the emptiness. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from somewhere below. It sounded like metal twisting, something heavy being dragged across the floor. My stomach tightened as I realized it was coming from the lower levels, the engine room. I hurried to the nearest elevator, but it wasn't working. The lights on the panel flickered, then went dark. I had no choice but to take the stairs. As I descended deeper into the ship, the temperature dropped. The air became thick, almost suffocating, and the groaning of the ship grew louder. When I reached the engine room, the door was slightly ajar. I hesitated, but I knew I had to find out what was going on. I pushed the door open, and immediately, a wave of cold air hit me. The room was dark, save for the flickering emergency lights casting long, ominous shadows across the machinery. And then I saw it. Something was moving between the massive turbines. It was hard to make out in the dim light, but it was large, much larger than any person. Its skin was slick and wet, glistening in the faint glow. It slithered across the floor, its body twisting unnaturally as it moved. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The creature stopped, as if sensing my presence, and slowly turned its head toward me. Its eyes, if you could call them that, were hollow, deep black pits that seemed to absorb the light around them. Without thinking, I stumbled back, slamming the door shut behind me. I could hear the thing moving, slithering toward the door. I didn't wait to find out if it could open it. I bolted up the stairs, my footsteps echoing in the empty corridors. When I reached the upper deck, the ship was still eerily silent. The passengers were gone, the crew missing. I ran to the bridge hoping to find someone, anyone. But it was empty too. I grabbed the radio, but all I got was static. The groaning of the ship grew louder, and I realized something terrible. The creature wasn't just in the engine room. It was part of the ship. The hull creaked and groaned, and I could feel the vibrations beneath my feet. The ship was changing, twisting, as if the creature was merging with it, taking control. I ran to the edge of the deck, looking out at the endless expanse of water. There was no escape, no land in sight. And then, the ship began to sink. I don't remember much after that. The water was freezing, pulling me under as the ship was consumed by whatever nightmare had taken hold of it. I fought to stay afloat, but the cold was unbearable. The last thing I remember was the sight of the ship disappearing beneath the waves, the creature's hollow eyes watching me as I slipped into unconsciousness. I woke up days later, washed up on a deserted island, alone. No one believes my story. The Horizon Dream was reported missing, never to be found. But I know the truth. The ship isn't at the bottom of the ocean. It's still out there, alive, waiting for its next victim. Cruises are supposed to be a dream getaway, a perfect escape from reality where everything is taken care of for you. For me, it was my first real vacation in years. I had been working non-stop, saving up for something special, and when I saw an offer for a week-long cruise through the Caribbean, I jumped at the chance. It was supposed to be a break from the mundane, but instead, it became a nightmare I'll never forget. It started like any other cruise. The ship was massive, almost like a floating city, with everything you could need: bars, pools, restaurants, and entertainment every night. I spent the first few days lounging by the pool, drinking fruity cocktails, and relaxing. It felt like paradise. I made friends with a couple of people, and we'd meet up for drinks or dinner, but mostly, I enjoyed the solitude. The third night, the ship was set to sail through a remote part of the Caribbean, far from any land. The captain even announced that the water was deeper than anything most of us would ever experience. The idea of being that isolated, with nothing but miles of water below and around us, was a little unsettling, but I shrugged it off. I wasn't going to let something like that ruin my vacation. After dinner, I decided to take a walk around the ship. Most people were either in the main hall for the evening show or at the bars, so the decks were relatively empty. I found a quiet spot near the ship's bow and leaned against the railing, staring out into the endless expanse of black water. The moon was barely a sliver in the sky, and the stars seemed to stretch forever. But there was something eerie about it. The sea was unnaturally still, not a single wave in sight. As I stood there, I started to hear something faint. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then it became clearer. It was a soft, almost melodic humming. I turned around, expecting to see someone nearby, but the deck was empty. The humming continued, growing slightly louder, but there was no one around. I shook my head, thinking maybe it was just the sound of the ship's engines, and decided to head back to my cabin. That night I had trouble sleeping. I kept hearing faint noises, footsteps outside my cabin door, a soft knock, and the occasional creak of metal. But every time I got up to check, the hallway was empty. The ship was massive, so I figured it was just the sound of the crew doing maintenance or late-night partiers wandering around. Still, something felt off. The next morning, I asked a couple of people if they'd heard anything strange, but no one had. One of the guys I had dinner with the night before joked that it was probably just the ghosts of shipwrecked sailors. I laughed it off, but his comment stuck with me. Something about the vast emptiness of the sea made that idea feel a little too real. That evening, I decided to explore the lower levels of the ship. I had heard there was a quiet lounge down there that wasn't as crowded as the upper decks. As I descended the stairs, I noticed that the lower I went, the colder it got. It didn't make sense. The upper decks were warm and humid. But down here, it was almost freezing. When I reached the lounge, I found it completely deserted. The lights were dim, casting long shadows across the room. There was no music, no bartenders, just silence. I hesitated at the doorway, feeling that creeping sense of unease again, but I stepped inside anyway. I needed to get out of the crowded upper decks for a bit. As I sat down in one of the plush chairs, I realized how unnaturally quiet it was. The usual hum of the ship's engines was gone, replaced by an eerie stillness. And then, I heard it again, the humming. This time, it was louder and clearer, and it was coming from behind me. I turned around quickly, expecting to see someone there, but there was no one. The humming continued, soft and melodic, but with a strange, almost mournful quality to it. I stood up, my eyes scanning the room, but it was empty. The only exit was the way I had come in. Just as I was about to leave, something caught my eye in the far corner of the lounge. It was faint, but I could see the outline of a figure, someone standing in the shadows. My breath caught in my throat. I called out, "Hello, is someone there?" The figure didn't move, didn't respond. It just stood there, completely still. My instinct screamed at me to leave, but for some reason I felt rooted to the spot. I took a step toward the figure, squinting in the dim light, and that's when it moved. It wasn't a normal movement. It was jerky, unnatural, like it was glitching through reality. The humming grew louder, almost deafening now, and I could feel a cold sweat break out across my skin. The figure took a step closer, and as it did, I could make out its features. It wasn't human. Its face was pale, almost translucent, with sunken eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. Its mouth hung open, but the humming wasn't coming from it. It was coming from somewhere deep within the ship, reverberating through the walls. The figure's limbs were twisted, as though they had been broken and never healed properly. I stumbled back, my hands fumbling for the door handle. The humming grew louder and louder, drowning out my thoughts. I yanked the door open and bolted up the stairs, my feet pounding against the metal steps as I raced to the upper decks. When I finally burst through the door onto the main deck, the noise stopped. The warm air hit me like a wave, and I gasped for breath. The ship was still moving, the passengers still laughing and drinking, completely oblivious to what had just happened. I looked back at the entrance to the lower levels, but everything seemed normal. No strange figure, no humming. I didn't go back to the lower decks after that. I spent most of the rest of the trip avoiding being alone. I didn't tell anyone what I had seen because I knew how it would sound. But I wasn't the only one who felt something was wrong on that ship. On the last night of the cruise, I overheard one of the staff talking in hushed tones to another crew member. They were discussing something about the old wreck, and how it happens every time they sail this route. I didn't catch all of it, but I heard enough to make me certain that I wasn't the only one who had experienced something strange. The cruise ended, and I left that ship with a heavy sense of relief, but the experience still haunts me. Late at night, when everything is quiet, I sometimes hear that humming in the back of my mind, and I can't help but wonder what I encountered out there in the middle of the ocean. And whether it's still out there, waiting for the next ship.